This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish in Oklahoma City and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. The plague of lying affects all of us. If everyone lies and everyone knows they're committed to lying, then when someone tries to tell the truth isn't heard. The great challenge of truth-telling is to be conformed to what is. When we lie, we turn our backs on what is and choose something else. So we teach everyone from the earliest age that to tell the truth is an imperative, not just for personal integrity, but for the protection of society and the possibility of a beneficent world. Telling the truth is good and lying is bad. The decision to tell the truth is an important one and can have gigantic consequences. The psychologist and author Dr. Jordan Peterson, in talking about his growth and development, said that one of the most important decisions in his life was his decision to stop lying. He said, "I committed myself to tell the truth in every situation." That doesn't sound particularly groundbreaking. It's what every Boy Scout commits himself to. But the impact on his life he found to be immense. More than anything, in addition to being clear about what he knew and what was going on in his life, it kept him away from the laziness of groupthink. He not only analyzed himself for whether he said true statements, he also monitored what he actually believed was true so that he could be confident in saying it, in place of simply going along with what other people say is true and then just repeating it. Saying what I know to be true and not saying anything else is a groundbreaking decision. It also involves a good deal of work and being honest with oneself. There are 1,000 options we inherit from the world around us, and we do repeat them without much thinking about them. To stop and to ask ourselves whether we know them to be true or whether they just conform to what we know to be the truth of our experience and our knowledge is an act of strict scrutiny. It's not easy to drill down into our conventional interchange with people and be honest with what we find there. In fact, mostly we just go along with the currents of society and repeat the slogans and mottos that we learn there. Certainly we don't think of ourselves as dishonest people for doing so. Mostly we think of ourselves as attentive and certain, even as we freely go on about the things that we don't know much about. That's how we live. Deciding to be strict in our honesty can be, according to Dr. Peterson, life-altering. Coming from a psychologist, perhaps it's not so groundbreaking. If you've talked to someone who's been in therapy, it's not uncommon for that person to share her insights about what she's discovered. And over, I've had someone tell me something like this: "I've just discovered this whole hidden side of myself. I had no idea I was..." And then she shares what she's excavated from her life. At the same time she's sharing, I say to myself, we've known this weakness in you forever. The only person that your weakness has been hidden from, apparently, is you. Analysis is important, and it begins by trying to tell the truth of ourselves. Making progress in healing and integrity depends on coming to know the truth of oneself. The aphorism is, "We're only as sick as our secrets." Certainly it is the case that the person who does not know herself carries the threat of sickness with her always. And truth is the first step to the cure. This same pharmacology is present in society as well. As a people, we have the same challenge to know and to tell the truth about ourselves and about our lives. The more lying we do, and the more often we're content to repeat what others say without doing the work to know if it's true, then the more potential we have to go off the rails. And just as a person who does not know the truth about herself in her own life can affect and damage the lives of those around her, so a society that thrives on lies can do immense damage to every person in it. When there is no light available to disclose the truth, there is darkness. And what flourishes in darkness flourishes because it's kept from the light. Lies create darkness, and they grow and multiply in the dark. We mostly don't spend much time thinking about what happens when lying becomes normal and expected in society. It's easy to joke about the obfuscations and misdirections, for example, of politicians and political speech. After all, those aren't exactly uncommon. And humor about the foibles and vanity of individuals is warranted and easy to summon. Up to a certain level, it's normal, and we all know that only the angels of light could be trusted to make every aspect of life completely on the up and up. But as Jefferson knew, we're not to be governed by angels, but by men. A fib around the edges is what we all understand and mostly learn to tolerate. However, when full-scale misrepresentation is expected and delivered, then we've passed into dangerous territory. To reach a point in which nothing of what is said matches reality, and nothing of what is promised and committed to is actually done, then we've reached a point where the common good of all is swapped for the common debasement of all. It can happen quickly, and when it does, everyone suffers. For years, for example, it was kind of a joke that the money appropriated for strengthening the levees around the city of New Orleans was siphoned off into other things. The city government never had much of a reputation for open reporting or truthful sharing. Everyone more or less knew the money assigned to one thing might or might not be spent as appropriated. And everyone expected some sleight of hand when it came to how the money was used and who benefited. In the grand scheme, there was a tight network of those who were satisfied with how this arrangement worked. Enough people benefited just enough from the misdirection that complaints about it and efforts to change it fell on deaf ears. Lying was expected and delivered. But when Hurricane Katrina fell on the city and the tidal surge crested the levees, suddenly the misdirection and structural misappropriation began to matter. The willingness to lie and the willingness to acknowledge lying and its consequences conspired to create a catastrophe that affected everyone in the city. Suddenly, the impact of not telling the truth carried away entire neighborhoods. Lying can affect everything, and its greatest impact is its power to leverage the arrangements of everyone's lives for the worse. Those sorts of arrangements happen everywhere. The church isn't exempt from the temptation to shave the truth and therefore achieve less than what she should have achieved. While always tasked with telling the truth and living the truth, everyone is tempted to misrepresent and falsify what has happened and what's done. Because telling the truth isn't easy. We all found this out in the revelations concerning clergy sexual abuse and their cover-ups. Not only did people not tell the truth about what they knew, there was a kind of culture of secrecy and a lack of truth-telling that followed in its wake. The ultimate result was a sentiment among senior clergy that there was no truth to tell. That is, what was done in those situations was simply business as usual, and that merited no comment. There's no news in that which isn't new, which is always the apex of temptation. If a person or an organization does not remain alert and attentive and always striving for the truth, it can hide truth-telling so thoroughly, and the knowledge of the truth ends up being relegated to darkness. In many cases, and among many dioceses, the people most shocked by the stories of what had happened were the clergy themselves. And we shouldn't pick on the church too much. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of things to say and plenty of truths still to drag into the light. I mean, though, there are other aspects of society and other elements of our lives deserving of the same treatment. We shouldn't treat the church as if it were unique in these aspects. As an organization, it is representative of all organizations. And as so, it points to what happens in those other places. If we haven't yet learned all the truths yet to be spoken of these places, it's because those truths have not yet been brought into the day. There's an additional aspect of the dynamics of lying and truth-telling revealed in the dynamics of the church and its experience, and it's this. One can tell true facts and still fail to tell the truth. Some of the reporting about the church fell into this category. The facts revealed were true, and the reported events happened just as was said. Yet in the choosing not to tell other facts and choosing not to admit other evidence, opting not to disclose what happened in other venues, all of this reporting sometimes made for a lack of truth. Lying by omission is still lying. faulting on the truth, no matter the reason, is to keep the truth from truly being known. It happened over and over when it came to telling the story of sex abuse in the church and leaving other stories untold. But this is not the most dangerous aspect and insidious aspect of lying. Certainly, not telling the truth is common and carries with it the price of undermining and dissolving what should be supported and trusted. However, it's still minor compared to the full-scale commitment of making lying the operating principle in society. At least, when only part of the truth is being told, there is part of the truth coming to light. What we come to know may be all wrong, but at least there is the benefit of it being half right. When the energies of society turn away from the truth completely, however, another dynamic takes over. There is an inversion of truth-telling, a doppelganger of sorts, in which members of society are committed to telling the untruth, the opposite of truth, rather than telling what is known to them and to tell it as being accurate and real and certain. Let me give you an example. It comes from the account of Walter Chiswick, who wrote the book, He Leadeth Me. He described his experience of being interrogated by the secret police in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow from 1941 to 1945. Father Chiswick was a missionary to Russia who had entered the country from Poland, following the conquest of eastern Poland by Russia in 1939, when it was allied with Germany at the start of World War II. He worked at a lumber camp with a fellow priest as they scoped out how they might begin to evangelize in the secularized society of the Soviet Union. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, this priest was arrested as a spy and sent off to Moscow to be interrogated by the secret police there. Father Chiswick described his interrogations. He was interrogated for 4 years, sometimes twice a day. Sometimes the interrogations would go on for 24 hours or longer with different teams. Sometimes he would go for a month without being questioned at all, and all of it was exhausting and demeaning. Combined with loneliness and the semi-starvation, the ceaseless attention from the interrogators caused him to arrive at a state of near hopelessness. No matter how attentive he was and no matter how insistent he answered and insisted on the truth of his answers, the interrogations continued. They were intent on forcing him to admit that he was a Vatican spy, that he had infiltrated the country to set up cells of resistance to the regime and that he was financed by secret sources in the Soviet Union, and that he was a part of a plot to overthrow the government. None of those things were true, and Father Chiswick continued to insist on his innocence and on the ridiculousness of the charges. But no matter what he said, the interrogations continued. After years of this abuse, they told him that they had prepared a document in which all the information they had agreed to was printed. All he had to do was review what it said and then sign the pages. When he saw the document, he was horrified. Every page misrepresented what he had said. None of the information he had given over and over was there. All of the accusations were simply repeated as they had been presented to him 4 years before, with none of the exculpatory explanations and revelations that he had provoked. It was all a nightmare. And even more so, the nightmare of more interrogation was sure to follow, if they were willing to compile such a document over such time with such energy. When he looked at it and reviewed its content, he knew they expected him to sign it. He then folded. Through tears, he picked up his pen and signed every page. He was defeated and humiliated. More than anything, Father Chiswick was corralled into the lie that the state had forced upon him. And once it was leveraged into his life, his position made him powerless to interfere. The lie not only pressured him, it overtook him. Even while this was going on, Father Chiswick kept wondering how the Soviet state could waste such time and energy on him. The investment they made in his testimony and the exhaustive investigation into him and his consciousness were startling. It's especially difficult considering that there was a war for national survival on. Every bit of manpower focused on him was taken away from some other task. And yet, in the midst of the all-out effort to resist invasion and then pursue victory, they chose to focus on him. What were they looking for? Hundreds of hours of interrogation were exhausted on him, all of it useless after a while. His answers didn't change, and their questions were never modified. From beginning to end, they continued to accuse him of being a spy, a provocateur, a terrorist. Nothing he said in response ever mattered. At the end of all those years, they ended up where they had started. Except at the end, he was exhausted and ready to give up. Eventually, he signed his confession. Through the veil of his tears, he surrendered his dignity and abandoned his righteousness in order for the entire ordeal to be over. This was certainly one of the goals of the process. Interrogation was not to obtain information, it was to demean and undermine the prisoner. As William Dalrymple notes about propaganda in totalitarian societies, and which we should take note of, he said, "The purpose is not to inform or influence. Its purpose is to humiliate those who believe it." So was the interrogation of Father Chiswick. Crushing his spirit wasn't the purpose, not the byproduct of their efforts. It was the point, but we have to pay attention to what the process entailed. The security police insisted he signed the document they had prepared. From beginning to end, they had known their charges against him were bogus. More than anyone else, they knew there were no connections to any other groups. In Soviet Russia, it was impossible to imagine there was a revolutionary cell hiding among the missionaries. Throughout the wartime chaos of a country reeling from the woes of invasion and total war, there could not have existed secret channels for financing, especially in a country in which money meant almost nothing. And yet, as they typed out their charges one by one, accusing this frayed Jesuit of crimes against the state one by one, they knew what they were doing. Yet they exhausted a huge wave of energy toward making sure he agreed. The outcome was not simply his total humiliation and the crushing of his spirit. It was also to have him lie and to engage him in the lie. The power of lying was not content with its own dishonesty. It had to ensnare him as well. The power was everywhere in the Soviet state. It defined the relations between every aspect of the country and between every level of society. A joke told by everyone about everything in the day-to-day in the drab world there was, "We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us." It's an anodyne comment on how things were done, and it could be bandied about by those who labor away today in the bowels of the large corporations here at home. But in the ethos of a state whose national commitment was to lying, it was a comment on the energy that captured everything. We should pay attention to Father Chiswick's experience. The power of the lie is the power to drag us into it. Because this power is at work, we're not simply bystanders. Either we are resisting to the lies told all around us, or because they are reinforced by the structures and operations of society, we are woven into them. By resisting, we are actively moving to vanquish them, pushing against them and their power in our lives. Either we do that or we are conquered by them. It's not sufficient simply to know what's being said and done is false. We have to abandon our responsibility if all we do is to tell ourselves we know the real truth of things. We fail if we know all of the energies the lying summons are contrary to what's really real as we say and do nothing. Unless we act and push and respond, we are not just silent, but complicit. There is a hint of the power of these energies in the description of Jesus on Palm Sunday. When Jesus enters Jerusalem, the entire population is animated by the promise that he might be the one to begin the revolution against the Roman occupation. As he trundles up the street on the back of a donkey, he's greeted with the language and gestures of a city welcoming a victorious general. The whole people are primed to act, and it's all based on fantasy. Nothing more than wishes spoken out loud. And when the crowd is disappointed, the cries of Hosanna are replaced by the cries of Crucify, with the same intensity and the same devotion. Not being based on truth, the energy is available to flow into any channel and to take any form. And it's powerful. When Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to his disciples, all of whom had abandoned him at his arrest and had fled when he faced his trial and his verdict, they were terrified. Of course, he was resurrected, and they were trying to understand what they were seeing and who. But it could be the case also that they who had stood by at his triumphal entrance into Jerusalem and were no doubt caught up in the energy of the moment that they also had been tempted to join the chant around him. Was it possible they also had cried out loudly, "Crucify"? Was it likely? The energy of a crowd there untethered by truth and unopposed by those committed to what is liable to demolish anything in its path. Even apostles are not immune. Perhaps especially apostles are not immune to untruth when they are so heavily reasoned and they have been so easily delegated and so readily absorbing the truth. They might not be equipped to spot the power of lying as easily as others and might not be very well equipped to move against it. Of course, the most challenging aspect of this power is when the lies become so much repeated, it never occurs to anyone they might be false. Indeed, one of the reasons they are repeated ad nauseum is so that we begin to accept them simply based on repetition. Lies take on a life of their own when they begin to sound natural and evident, and given enough time, we might not be capable of understanding them as lies at all. That was the case in George Orwell's warning in the novel 1984. He warned the power of the news and the immediacy of advertising made it possible for us to lose touch with what is true until we're primed to believe almost anything at all. After a while, we can believe it. We can truly believe that what we believed yesterday and all of the days before it is now false, while what we knew to be false until yesterday is true today. While we all read these descriptions of his story with a slight smirk, just a brief set down with, say, 2 years' worth of videos on YouTube is enough to give us pause. It certainly really is possible to be buffeted by lies, and until the truth is bruised and all who hold it are so blackened they let go of them, we have no work at acknowledging and living the truth. Unless we truly act to examine ourselves and our behavior with a fundamental commitment to honesty and a desire to live the truth, we may find ourselves lost. As in most things, moral and judicious, it won't be a sudden fall into the lair of falsity, but instead a gentle turning toward another pathway. But unless we're willing to keep the maps we have, unless we're willing to keep checking that we're in fact walking in the right direction, we can end up so captured by the gravity of our situation, we find we can't get out. And that's really frightening. In one of the most cited scenes in all of the New Testament, and so cited because it's also one of the most powerful, the Pharisee Saul was on his way to Damascus to carry out his plan to arrest those who were following Jesus. Saul was captured by his commitment to arrest them and perhaps to seal their fate in the same way he had sealed Stephen's with execution. But as he approached the city, he was overcome by a bright light so incandescent it knocked him to the ground. And from the light he heard a voice, "Saul, why do you persecute me? I am Jesus, the one you persecute." And in response, when he heard that, his animus drifted away. In this encounter, our encounter with the truth of things, which Paul saw face to face, his life was made different. So also, in the encounter with Christ, ours may be as well. Back in just a moment. Welcome to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called If I Could. If I could relive my days again, would I? Remediate and redeem my sins, but the life's still mine. Another shot at the trophy, a good life well lived, filled with reasons to hope, all stumbling stones sieved. In my fantasy, all mistakes would be fully evaded, all hesitation free, each moment grasped and graded. But with such prospects, I'd become a different me. I fear I'd fully reject the light and dark that helps me see. That's if I could. The Lord fills us with the goodness of His invitation that we might live life to the full, and that's what we strive to do as we explore continually what it means to be living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.